As the shuttle touches down at the designated landing site, the work crew get the first real look at the scope of their task. The vast majority of the ground in this area is simply laden with pollutants. There are a few small patches of relatively healthy land, but clearing up a large enough space to accomplish their task will not be a quick endeavour. This wasn't Trev's first rodeo when it came to working off his sentence, so he was quick to take charge of the group and put them to work. He first got them planting a field of tox potatoes, a special variety of potato that could survive the polluted earth. Although they were extra dangerous if not prepared properly, and the yield would be much lower than standard potatoes, but their options were limited. The ship had come stocked with some survival meals, but those would run out soon. Although their primary job was to clean up the site, Trev saw the group's primary objective as keeping the nerd alive long enough for the robots to do all of the cleaning. Survival didn't just mean shooting down any locals though, it also meant ensuring that the group had food, shelter, and managed to keep themselves safe from the pollution. The crew were free to use any means at their disposal to complete the task, so Lola suggested they plant some psychoid too. They could use the comms console to trade with passing ships in orbit, and psychoid would give them something valuable they could trade. Trev sets up the work schedules for everyone, and gets them going on setting up their new home. In the interest of keeping the nerds safe, Trev commands them to stay inside the ship for the time being, to stop them from getting sick from exposure to the pollution. The rest of the crew would just have to hope that their gas masks would keep them protected in the meantime. Since everything they were doing here was about getting back some of their own time, they had no interest in wasting any, and so the nerd, or Erison as he was actually called, immediately set his two little cleaning mechanoids to the task of clearing the pollution from a patch of ground to the side of the ship. Only moments after they land, a bulk goods trader passes by in orbit and contacts the group. They don't have much to trade aside from some of the basic materials that the ship had come stocked with, but Trev agrees to part with half of their medicine and all of the wood they've chopped down, in exchange for an advanced component. He understands that the advanced components could help them out a lot in the future, and he felt that they had plenty of medicine. And despite the state of the surrounding area, trees were the one thing they weren't short on. The shuttles that the crew were sent on for these missions were usually pretty standard, with maybe some slight deviation depending on the specific task that they were to carry out. In this case, the shuttle had been outfitted with a small mechanoid lab, featuring a gestator, a charger, and 2 waste pack atomizers, which could be used to safely destroy the pollution that they removed from the ground. Outside of this, the ship was fairly standard, featuring a small barracks for the group to sleep in, a comms console for them to contact the main ship once their job was done, a helm to pilot the ship from, a recreation room with a TV, a nutrient paste dispenser, a bathroom with a set amount of water stored in the ship's water tanks, and power in the form of 4 chem fuel generators in the maintenance room. This would cover most of the group's basic needs, but they knew from previous experience that there were a few things they could do to help make life a little easier. The first was to hook up some solar panels to the ship. The ship did have a chem fuel refinery on board, but refining fuel took time and organic material, neither of which the crew would have in abundance, so if they could wean themselves off of using chem fuel for power, it'd give them one less thing to worry about. After a hard day working getting their setup going, the group sat down to enjoy their dinner at the table, whilst they watched some TV on the tiny old set they'd been supplied, before they turned in for the night. The joy of having the robots handle the cleaning for them was that they could work through the night as long as they had power, and so it was that when the group awoke on their first full day on the planet, they were already able to start loading some of the polluted materials into the atomizer to be disposed of. Although the ship had a decent stockpile of water, and a system to recycle a lot of the water that they used, the group figured it'd make more sense to hook up the plumbing system to a pump that could draw up water from the ground, making the system essentially self-sustaining for the length of time they'd need to be here. Erison, their nerd, suggested to the group that they use some of the materials they had been sent to produce another cleaning mechanoid, to help speed up the process, as well as a lifter mechanoid to help haul things around the site. Eager to complete their mission as soon as possible, and eager to avoid breaking their backs hauling stuff, the group happily agreed. As they lay in the barracks that night, Lola mentioned that she grew up on a planet where pollution had been a big issue, and she knew that they'd need to keep the waste cold if they wanted to stop it from seeping back into the ground. The atomizers worked quite slowly, so it was likely that the mechanoids would extract more than the atomizers could handle, and they would need to store the excess until it could be atomized. Luxembourg suggested using some of the wood that they'd gathered whilst clearing the fields to build a small storeroom that they could keep frozen, allowing them to clear plenty of the pollution even if the atomizers were backlogged. They made quick work of the structure the next day, but unfortunately they'd used up most of the steel that they'd arrived with, which would be required for the temperature control unit. Surveying further out into the area, Trev noticed a few old steel buildings that he decided they could pull down to repurpose, giving them quick access to more steel. Tim was a Neanderthal, and his innate strength meant that he was often given sentence-reducing work in the mining colonies, so he was quick to notice some steel deposits in the nearby hills, and offered to start extracting them too, to bolster the group's supplies. It wasn't long before the group were called upon to protect themselves from locals, but this local happened to be a rather vicious monkey who didn't take kindly to their presence in its home. One thing the prison corporation hadn't skimmed out on was their weapons though, and Tim's charge shotgun made light work of the beast. After he figured out how to aim, that is. Although this planet was a polluted mess, it was on a trade route, and clearly a passing ship was having a bad time, as a few large chunks of it crashed through the atmosphere and into the ground, offering a good source of steel and components to the crew. One of the ship's crew soon followed, crashing to the ground in his transport pod, injured but alive. Trev ordered Erison to go and rescue him, although it wasn't from the goodness of his heart. Anyone stranded on this planet had essentially only 2 choices: help the crew and leave when the starship came back to collect them, or take their chances out there in the pollution, which gave Trev some great negotiating power when it came to trying to convince them to help out with the cleanup effort. With all their new steel sources, the group quickly outfitted the storeroom with a freezer unit the next morning, and began moving their accumulating pile of pollutant waste into the room for safekeeping. Which was just as well, as the mechanoids had been making excellent progress on the first patch already. It was unclear if it was a result of the same crash that had brought them their current patient, but another escape pod soon slammed into the dirt nearby, and the group were quick to scoop up another potential new teammate. It wasn't long before the true locals showed up to cause trouble for the group. Thankfully, the first scout was a simple club-wielding fellow who wandered into the area near where Tim was mining. Figuring that even with his shoddy aiming, a charged shotgun beats a wooden club, Tim moved to engage him. He wasn't wrong, but his aim really was terrible. While the attacker was bleeding out in the dirt, Tim called over Erison and suggested he take the gas mask the attacker had been wearing, as it would allow him to venture out from the ship, although they still didn't want him going too far for safety purposes. With the first segment of ground to the side of the ship cleared of pollution, Luxembourg suggested that they start utilising it to plant more conventional crops, including cotton for clothing and trading purposes, and some corn, to produce a large volume of food for them. The corn would take a long time to grow, but the Tox potato field should be plenty to keep them going in the meantime. One of the local boomalopes soon wandered over to the ship and began interacting with the crew as if it was already fully domesticated. Were it any other creature, they would likely have slaughtered it for dinner, but a boomalope could be an invaluable replenishable source of chem fuel for them, so they decided to keep it close for now. With the first new section cleared, Erison wasted no time in setting the robots to clearing another section of the ground. With the basics of their little settlement firmly established, and the locals having clearly found their position, the crew got to work on their primary objective, defending themselves. They began this by using some of the lumber they'd collected to create defensive barricades which would face outward from the ship in all directions. This would allow them plenty of positions to take cover behind, no matter which direction the attackers approached from. With their new boomalope friend at risk of wandering off to find greener pastures, the group quickly threw together a small pen to keep it in. The pen was still mostly polluted soil at the moment, so unlikely to be able to sustain the beast on its own, but the mechanoids were hard at work clearing the pollution from the area. Once it was cleared, the natural vegetation growth should feed the beast. But just to be on the safe side, the group also decided to utilise the first small section of the pen that was cleared of pollution to plant a small field of hay, to ensure that the animal wouldn't struggle for food. With all the hard work under relatively poor conditions, the crew's moods were starting to nosedive. Trev decided that with most of their immediate needs taken care of, some time could be spent on improving their living conditions. The first task on that side would be to build each of them their own space, so that they could escape the cramped conditions in the ship's barracks, which were an even worse place to be now that one of the people they dragged back there had died on the floor. In the interest of giving everyone a little breathing room as quickly as possible, they began throwing together some wooden shacks for each of the team to call home, although they weren't quite quick enough to stop Luxembourg from joining Lola in a mental breakdown. Working hard, they managed to finish the first shack that night, just in time for Trev to join the others in a breakdown of his own. As their de facto leader though, it was decided that he should have the first shack. Although they seriously reconsidered this act of kindness after his mental breakdown caused him to completely destroy one of the ship's engines. Thankfully, the ship had redundant engines, so they'd simply need to seal up the hull, but it was a shame to lose out on the components they could have gotten from dismantling the engine in a more controlled manner. The tantrum at least served to relieve a lot of the stress for Trev, allowing him to get back to work and finish up the second shack in quick time, allowing Luxembourg to also move out of the ship. All of the shacks would be built on polluted ground, so the group would be subjected to some pollution at night, as they simply couldn't keep their masks on while they slept. But once the boomalope pen was cleared, the shacks would be next on the list to be cleaned out. With a few friendly goats joining the group the next morning, they felt reaffirmed in their choice to clean out the animal pen first, as they would need to make sure they had plenty of vegetation in there to feed this newly increased flock size. The last shack was soon constructed, allowing all of the group to move out of the ship, except for Erison. The barracks in the ship was nice enough for a single person, and it felt more secure than the shacks from a security standpoint, so it made sense to them to keep the nerd in there for the time being. Speaking of security, Luxembourg suggested that she might feel a little more safe if they had some automated turrets dotted around the settlement. They weren't quite sure on how to build something that advanced, but with their nerd now having extra space in his room for a research bench, Trev tasked him with figuring it out. The next day, the group began to bring in their first harvest of tox potatoes, putting an end to their anxiety over their food security. With most of the group out harvesting, Erison in his room studying, and the mechanoids out cleaning the pollution, it really felt like the group were getting into a good flow of things. Trying to make the best of a bad situation, Lola suggests that they use the space where the engine used to be to create a small freezer, to make sure that the food in their nutrient paste hoppers didn't go off. With the pen almost fully cleared of pollution, the group began planning out the mechanoid's next job, clearing out the pollution from the shacks. As they did so, a wanderer approached the ship and asked to join them. Although they'd usually be interested in the help, Lola was a little concerned about their ability to feed another person with their current supplies, so they sent poor Tommy on his way. Having torn down the ruins of numerous old buildings in the area, the group had amassed a small pile of bricks, which they decided to start using to put down some floors in the shacks, making them just that little bit more homely. It wasn't long before the attacks they'd been warned of began, with two groups of raiders crashing down in drop pods and charging towards the settlement, locals intent on stopping the expansion of the corporation onto their planet. The group were a bit scattered, but Trev had trained them for this. Hearing the sounds of the pods, they all rushed to meet up in the centre of the settlement, with Erison even grabbing a pistol to help out, whilst calling the mechanoids to him to use them as cannon fodder. They could be repaired a lot easier than the group could be. The attack came too quickly for them to reach the defences, so they hid behind one of the shacks instead, forcing the raiders to close in. Most of the group were lacklustre marksmen at best, so the closer they could get the attackers, the better. Luxembourg especially hated using guns, and much preferred using her axe. As the attackers approached the solar panel, the group jumped out and started blasting. Whilst one of the attackers dashed past the suddenly appearing crew, they focused their fire on the other, taking them down in only 2 volleys. Luxembourg rushed in and caved in the skull of another of the attackers who was trying to bash Erison with a club. Erison, for his part, commanded one of the cleaning bots to annoy the attacker who'd sprinted past them, hoping to stop him from damaging the solar panel until the group could deal with him. The group then pulled back behind the shack once more, in an attempt to lure the rest of the attackers closer. As another attacker rounded the corner, oblivious to the group's presence, they opened fire, and added another kill to their tally. With the attackers' numbers suitably thinned, most of the group charged towards the remaining attacker in the fields, whilst Lola moved over to help the cleaning mechanoid deal with the other attacker. The crew's poor marksmanship was on full display when they tried to take out the raider in the fields, but thankfully Luxembourg was able to dish out a ton of damage with her axe. With the group turning to help Lola finish the final attacker, they'd successfully defended the settlement against its first real attack. The group had suffered some minor injuries, and the poor cleaning mechanoid had taken quite a beating, but overall it was a successful outcome. That night, while the shame of watching his teammates fire wildly into the dirt was fresh in his mind, Trev decided that they should focus on setting up a shooting range, so that everyone could practice their aim a little during their downtime. It wasn't long before another drop pod, this time a damaged one, crashed onto the planet, spitting out another injured inhabitant. With a lot of the team in bed recovering from their injuries, this was actually a great time to try and convince the person to join them. If only because the crew were clearly in dire need of someone else who knew how to properly handle a gun. After dragging her to the maintenance room for holding, Luxembourg unfortunately realised that this new person was suffering from paralytic abasia, so would be unresponsive for a long time yet. But the group felt that they were doing okay on the food side of things, so they didn't mind waiting out the abasia to secure themselves another pair of helping hands. They did, however, decide to throw together a small shack on the edge of the settlement to store her in, until she woke up. Tim and Luxembourg soon let the others know that they'd started dating. Relationships weren't uncommon on these sort of excursions, so Trev was only too happy to help them outfit one of the shacks with a double bed for them to share. If nothing else, it would help keep their morale up until the job was done. With the first target practice dummy built, Trev was exceptionally happy to see Tim taking advantage of it to practice his aim, as he was one of the most shockingly poor marksmen of the group. At least with a shotgun, he wasn't trying to hit anything at great distances. Seeing the target in use also made Trev realise that the wall of his shack might take a fair pounding from stray bullets. Eager not to wake up missing an ear one morning, he elected to build a small backstop around the targets. As Luxembourg cleared the debris from the firing range, a nearby wild woman approached a panther which had been languishing around the settlement and attempted to kill it with her bare hands, to the panther's advantage. Watching the panther slurp down the spoils of its kill, the crew decided that they didn't love the idea of the panther nor the tiger that were suspiciously close to them at all times, and elected to tackle the issue head on. If nothing else, it was some extra target practice for them all. As time went on, the group became more and more eager to clear the pollution from their shacks, so even began joining in with the mechanoids' cleaning efforts themselves to help speed up the process. The eventual area they would need to clear of pollution was 130 metres squared. In order to give the group something to visualise, Erison suggested outlining the area they'd need to clear, marking the corners with small barricades, just to give them something to aim for. With the target practice being such a hit, Luxembourg felt a little bit left out given her hatred of guns. But thanks to the newly obtained Panthera fur, the group were able to build her her own dummy to practice her melee fighting skills on. The group had started to shut down some of their chem fuel generators, preferring to save their chem fuel for the ship's engines and for another project that Lola had suggested. But with their batteries getting emptier each day as a result, Lola volunteered to try and tame another of the boomalopes that were roaming the wastes to the south. This would give them a more stable supply of chem fuel. Plus, if they managed to get a female one, they could start their own herd, giving them a valuable resource that they could trade. Their power issues weren't being helped by the current eclipse, as the solar panels spent a whole day being useless, depleting their batteries and sending them into darkness for the night. The next morning, as the power slowly came back on, they were rudely interrupted by a series of drop pods landing straight through the roof of Lola's shack. Thankfully, this time most of the group were nearby, and they were able to stack up on one of the two pods which had dropped outside of the shack, allowing Luxembourg to lock the attacker into melee combat immediately, whilst the others unloaded their guns. Ignoring the other external attacker for the moment, Luxembourg swung open the door to Lola's shack and goaded the attackers inside into attacking her, distracting them whilst the rest of the crew weaved shots around her, making quick work of the attackers. While Luxembourg ran inside the shack to put out the fires they'd started, the rest tried to give chase to the final attacker, looking to take him down with their guns. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a speedy little devil and had scampered away before they could stop him. Quite honestly, it was a spectacularly poor attempt at an attack from the locals, and the crew hoped that the utter failure of it might put them off attacking again for a while. With their two solar panels not filling the batteries enough to last them the night, the group had to admit defeat and spend some more of their precious steel and components on a third solar panel. Although they weren't super light on materials, with traders being so irregular, it was best to use the materials they had sparingly. With the slow speed of the waste pack atomizers, the waste pack stockroom was soon full. The crew had added a couple of shelves to it in order to store their excess food in the frozen environment, but they began to tear down some of the shelves to make space for more waste packs. They would need to think of a quicker way of dealing with the packs if they wanted to make it out of here this century. Sadly, it seemed that another faction of locals hadn't heard about the utter failure of the last attack, and decided they should have a go at getting rid of these off-worlders themselves, dropping directly into the animal pen. The crew were excited to finally have a chance to use the barricades they'd set up, only for the world to deal them another disappointment, as each of the attackers had only crude melee weapons, making taking cover quite redundant. On the upside, it gave the crew of the ship a massive advantage in the fight, even despite their shoddy aim. Poor Lola and Trev did take some minor hits, but with the mechanoids helping by tripping up the attackers, the crew had soon dealt with this attack too. Despite the waste pack storage issues, the cleanup was going quite well, with most of the shacks now pollution free, with only Tim and Luxembourg still to go. Although their stealing components were precious to them, the group had barely made a dent in their task, and had already been attacked numerous times, so they all felt justified in utilising the fruits of Erison's research and spending some of their remaining stealing components on a number of turrets which would ring the settlement. The small loose smattering of turrets was unlikely to do severe damage to any attackers, but no one was likely to run headfirst at a turret across an open field, and simply slowing attackers down would give the crew the advantage of time. Time to plan their attack and approach the situation with caution. Despite another of the local boomalopes going mad, Lola was actually able to convince the one she'd been befriending to follow her back to the pen. So as Lola led its old friend back to the safety of the pen, Tim put down the angry boomalope. Another wanderer approached the ship, looking for a way off the planet. This time though, impressed by his marksmanship skills, the group were happy to accept Ferry into the crew. Ferry was equally eager to see their mission done, so that he could escape this polluted mess of a planet too. With the catatonic fur having been moved into one of the proper shacks after Tim moved in with Luxembourg, that left the tiny shack for Ferry. But the group tried their best to spruce the place up a little for him. Things were going somewhat well as the group began to bring in their first psychoid and cotton harvests, along with their third tox potato harvest. They could have been making quicker progress on the pollution cleanup, but otherwise they'd done well to set themselves up in a nice position since landing. With storage space on the ship not exactly being abundant, and the group not being overly fond of the idea of storing their food next to all the toxic pollutants they'd gathered up, they figured a good next step might be to build themselves a separate storeroom for all the things they might accumulate while they were here. The arrival of a passing weapons merchant in orbit meant the group were able to offload a lot of the weapons they'd taken from the failed attacks, giving them a bit more extra silver to spend when a trader with more useful goods arrives. With their goats having given birth, they now had 4 female goats and 2 males. Not interested in starting a petting zoo, nor a flock, they decided to eat the 2 male goats, keeping the females alive to provide them with milk. Trev was actually quite proud of the genius of his shooting range idea, as not only was it helping to improve everyone's skills, but it had become the crew's favourite pastime whilst they were here. The next few days went smoothly, with the crew finishing up the storeroom and the additions to Ferry's shack. And, not long after, they were even bringing in their first harvest of corn. In fact, perhaps the first corn that had been grown in the soil of this planet for centuries. It felt kind of good bringing life back to the place. Of course, as the arrival of yet another attack from the locals reminded them, they weren't only here to bring life back to the planet, they were also here to bring death to anyone who tried to stop them. With the attacking party split into 3 groups and seemingly biding their time before they attacked, the crew decided to take the initiative and stalked out into the field, aiming for the solo attacker to the north first. As a group they were quite bad shots, but Trev himself was a dab hand with his charge sniper, and he managed to put the first attacker down all by himself. Moving on to the group of 4 attackers to the south, the crew tried to take cover behind some trees. But this fight only served to showcase how, even with better weapons, if they couldn't aim properly, they would still face a lot of difficulties. In an attempt to take out just the first 2, both Erison and Lola were knocked to the ground, and Ferry and Tim had both taken some damage too. Eager for the opportunity to treat their wounds and return to the settlement before the third group decided to attack, The remaining crew members swarmed the last two of the southern attackers, with Luxembourg taking her axe to one, whilst the rest of the crew got close enough to the other to make sure they couldn't miss. Even so, Ferry and Luxembourg took more damage. While Tim grabbed Erison and Trev grabbed Lola, Luxembourg tended to Ferry's most pressing injuries. Unfortunately, the third group weren't kind enough to let the crew regain their strength, and they began their attack from the southwest. Tim and Trev, as the only two still standing in the settlement, charged out to meet them, making quick work of the first opponent. The turrets were doing their job, with a number of the attackers being pinned down in their positions by the turret's fire. One of the baby goats got caught in the crossfire, but while they were distracted by the turret, Tim snuck behind another of the attackers and blasted them straight into the afterlife. To the north, one of the turrets went down, so Tim and Trev split up, with Trev heading north to deal with the attacker there, whilst Tim tried to take down the two who were still being pinned down by the turret. He began making his way around behind the attackers to try and flank them. Luxembourg and Ferry had taken to tending to themselves now that Ferry was stabilised, but would be too far away from the action and too injured to get involved. Trev had managed to get Lola to a bed, but hadn't had a chance to tend to her, and things were looking bleak. He chose to ignore the attacker he'd gone after, figuring saving Lola was more important than saving their stockpile. Meanwhile, Tim's flanking manoeuvre worked a treat, and he took down yet another of the attackers, before advancing on the last attacker who was also being pinned down by the equally heroic turret. Landing a few good hits on this attacker, but taking his fair share in the process, Tim decided he'd done enough, and retreated back to the settlement for treatment, hoping that the blood loss would handle the attacker for him. In the stockpile, fire had broken out, but the lifter mechanoid was doing its best to limit the damage by engaging the attacker in combat. Erison must have been conscious enough to still be directing the mechanoid, as he made it retreat, drawing the attacker outside of the building and into the waiting barrel of Tim's shotgun. Unfortunately, despite Tim's valiant solo assault against 4 of the attackers, and his heroic firefighting efforts which saved the stockpile from destruction, Lola's injuries, mixed with Trev's lackluster medical knowledge, led her to a slow death from blood loss. As one of the last ones standing, Tim also had to tend to himself, whilst Trev ventured out to drag Ferry back to safety after Luxembourg suffered from a mental breakdown. Having been left bleeding in his bed without treatment since he was dragged back through the dirt, Erison's injury got infected, which could cause a major issue. But with Luxembourg snapping out for days after having vented all of her anger, she'd regained her composure enough to treat his infection. With 4 of the team down, 1 dead, and only 2 remaining on their feet, it'd been a really rough night for the crew. But that was unfortunately just the life of a convict on the Rimworlds, and the work would continue on nonetheless. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever is, wherever you are. Thanks so much for watching the new video, I really hope you enjoyed it. I realised as I was editing this episode that I was actually super excited to finally get to play Odyssey, since my last series kept me stuck on Biotech for a while, and I've only realised after editing this video that I didn't really use any of the new stuff from Odyssey for this series. So if you have any ideas for any cool Odyssey series, or even if you've just seen some particularly interesting new mods that are running on Odyssey, please do let me know. I do have plans for a couple of series which will hopefully utilise it more, but I'm always open to suggestions. I'm also open to feedback, so please do share your thoughts on the series down in the comments below. I shall have another episode out for you shortly, but until then, I hope that life treats you well, and I hope that you're looking after yourself. Bye bye!